Hi, I'm Brianna Wegner with the NRCS Soil Survey. I work in the Fargo Soil Survey office, and we cover parts of North Dakota and a lot of western Minnesota, focusing on the Red River Valley, and then some other places in Minnesota as well. And today we're kind of going to go over the soil texture challenge. You'll get the answers, and we'll kind of walk through how maybe we got to those answers, as well as talk about a little bit about soil sample storage and maintenance, more so for educators if they want to reuse these soil samples that they have. So, I got this bag of soil, and you can kind of see in it that there's some clumps in it, and a lot of times clumps are not ideal if the soil is dry. So when the soil is moist, it's not that big of a deal. We can actually use that to our advantage, but when our soils are dried, they can be really hard to work up in texture. So what I did was I just used a sieve to sieve mine. And so this is a mesh number 10 or a 2mm sieve, which is sort of the standard in soil scientists, the one we use the most. And so this is what the mesh size looks like inside. And if you don't have access to something like this, another option for you might be that you could find either some mesh at like the hardware store, get some hardware fabric, I think it's called, and you could maybe like make your own sieve, or even like children's sand toys sometimes will work just as well in a classroom setting for trying to get some of those bigger clumps out, so that we have something nice and granular, kind of like this. And so then I put the sieved stuff in this just Tupperware container so that we can reuse it in the future. And some of you might be wondering, like, okay, well, I'm going to save it and I'm going to use it year after year, but after a time, it starts to look like you just got all these texture balls in there. What do? Don't throw those away. Encourage students not to just throw this away. You can save this, you can reuse this. It does take a little bit of work, but what you can do with your dried up texture balls, or even your clumps, if you have a particularly clumpy, cloddy sample, is that you can either use an old decommissioned coffee grinder to grind those soils, pass them through a sieve, or you can use a mortar and pestle if you have access to those things. That one's a little bit labor intensive, but it's also an option. Or one that I find is really effective here in the River Valley is I'll take a baggie. So I'll put the sample in a baggie, kind of like this, and I might double or triple bag it, and then take like a towel or a cloth and kind of wrap the bag in it like this, and then I'll take a hammer and I'll smash the bag and cloth to help break up those clods. So make sure you put it on a sturdy surface like a workbench or the floor or the sidewalk. I oftentimes will go out and go on the sidewalk, use the sidewalk for that. And then that, again, kind of labor intensive, but if you don't have a soil grinder, it works at trying to break up a lot of these larger pieces that are going to be more difficult to texture, or if you've got these texture balls that are already been worked up. Yeah, and then, Tupperware is nice and easy. You can label it. So this one's labeled number 1. Easier. It's, in my opinion, they're easier to store and stack on shelves than just having baggies everywhere of samples. And, you know, if the airlock thing too also will kind of help, not that you need to keep it fresh, but it'll kind of help, you know, preserve the integrity of that sample. So that's a little bit about soil sample prep and maintenance. We'll get into our first sample, sample number 1. And I already kind of have a texture bowl started here. So if you're looking for how I got to this point, you know, we do have a how to texture soils video on YouTube to check out, but I basically took a handful of soil and then squirted it with water a little bit. I prefer using a squirt bottle like this, but really any sort of device that transfers water will work just as well. I feel like I have more control over the amount of water I'm using with a spray bottle. But that's just my personal preference. And so you'll work it up like this, and till you get that consistency of the flow chart says putty. I think maybe Play-Doh is a little bit more relatable, or something that more people know what that feels like, right? And then we start going through this chart. And now there's a couple things with this chart that may be confusing, or that maybe as a seasoned soil scientist, I'm like, oh, but you know, there are exceptions to the rules, right? And so we'll kind of talk about those as we go through them. But I just want to remind everybody that this is a very subjective test. So it's a field test that we do outside in the field to determine the soil texture. You know, is it clayey? Is it silty? Is it sandy? And a lot of that will then directly kind of relate to what kind of plants can we grow in this soil? Can we build a road here? Is this going to maybe be better served as a gravel pit than as a pasture, right? Those types of things. So soil texture is going to help us determine what we can do on that piece of land, as well as how likely is it going to be eroded, right? So soils that are higher in silt are maybe going to be more prone to wind erosion. Same with soils that are maybe a little bit higher in sand. And then we also, you know, soils that are higher in clay are going to be more prone to flooding and ponding as well. So those are some of the reasons why texture and texturing a soil is important in the grander scheme of things. All right, so we've got our ball. It's the consistency of putty, and now we're asking ourselves, does it remain in a ball when squeezed? It stays together when I squeeze it, so we'll say yes. And now we're gonna start our ribbon. And so this is the part where there can be some exceptions, right? So if we don't form a ribbon at all, we're gonna go to loamy sand. But this is forming a ribbon. So then we go to our next box, which is it a strong ribbon? That's like, what does a strong ribbon look like? And so to me, it's something that kind of, it's able to stand on its own, right? It's holding its shape very, very well. You know, you can kind of flop it about and it's not gonna fall apart real easily, right? Let me look at my thing. Okay, so we'll do this again, and find the spot where it breaks off right? So there, I got a really long ribbon out of that, right? And so now we're wondering, is it strong? Is it medium? Is it weak? That's a tough thing to decide, right? And so medium is obviously in between floppy and stiff, right? So it's sort of in between. It's going to hold its shape, but it's going to fall apart if we move it about too much, right? So now we have to measure it. And according to our flow chart, it's saying 2.5 to 5 centimeters long. So either we're going to need to just know what that looks like, we're going to need some kind of measuring tool. So one thing that I have in the field is this field book for describing and sampling soils. So this is sort of like our soil survey guidebook that we use to help describe the soil. So if you're ever wondering where the chart's about, well, what kind of effervescence class should I use? It's in this book. If you're ever wondering, well, where are all the alphabet letters for horizons? It's in this book. There's a texture triangle in here. There's just so much information, but it's also on the back has a ruler. So we can then use this to measure if we need to. Another rule of thumb, it doesn't really apply to here because we're working in centimeters and you know, we deal in inches a lot of the time, but like if you take your thumb, and so from your first knuckle to the tip of your thumb is approximately 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters, give or take, you can use that to measure in a pinch. But so we have our ribbon, it fell off. I'm going to say that this is medium strength ribbon. Another, I guess, way you could distinguish maybe something that is a strong ribbon is that where your thumb and your finger push the soil through is going to be a little bit of a shine. And so we don't have that really on this sample, right? There's not really a good shine from the smearing. And that shine is usually indicates that we have a lot of clay in that sample. But it's also, because of that clay, going to produce a stronger ribbon. So we have our ribbon now, we're going to measure. And so for this, I had to straighten it out a little bit, right? So we'll put it on our measuring thing and we'll see here. Oh, that's not very straight, but you get the idea. We're at what, 7 or so centimeters. So this is where, you know, looking at our chart, you need to focus on both the strength of the ribbon and the length. And in my opinion, I think the strength of the ribbon is going to outweigh the length of the ribbon, right? Because you can have a really weak ribbon that will be, you know, 10 centimeters long. It's still going to fall into, you know, sandy loam, silty loam, or loam, right, in this flow chart. So I would say if you're at a loss, so like in this example, we have a medium ribbon that's 7 centimeters long. Well, that's longer than 5 centimeters. What do? Go with its medium ribbon. So we're going to go with this middle column, right? So that's sort of your tiebreaker in the event where your ribbon doesn't really jive with what's on the flow chart. Okay, so now we've decided we're going to go with that middle column. And so what we're going to do is something called a sand wash. And so the flow chart says to excessively wet a pinch and rub it between your fingers like this. I prefer to cup my hand like this and squirt some water into the middle of it, and then take a pinch of soil. You don't need a lot, so just like this little bit here, and then it's kind of hard to see at this angle, but you put that sample in the water and you move your finger around, and that's how you're gonna feel the sand grains, so the grit, also the absence of sand grains. So our chart asks, does it feel very gritty? I'm gonna say there's some grit there, but it's not very gritty. And then our next question, moving on, does it feel very smooth? Well, it feels kind of smooth, but I wouldn't say that it feels very smooth. So that leaves us with neither gritty nor smoothness sort of dominates the texture, which puts us at clay loam. So the answer for number 1 is clay loam. And that is how we arrive at that answer using the flowchart. And then I can't remember if I mentioned this before. I'll say it now because I just spilled my water all over my sheet. But if you're worried about, you know, trying to keep your flowchart readable and clean and whatever, I highly suggest putting it in a sheet protector. This is a folder that just has a sheet protector front that I found. But, you know, a plain old sheet protector will work. This is the one that I use in the field. You can see it's pretty dirty and grungy, but if it ever gets too dirty, I can always just switch the sheet protector as well, or even try and wipe it off. And so then that way, even while you're working, if there is a spill or, you know, grubby hands are touching it, you can still read it and still follow through on the chart. And so now don't throw your texture ball away, right? You can take it and you can put it back in our sample number 1 container, put the cover on, and there we can save it for next year, or, you know, the next time we want to practice. It's there and it's saved and we have it. And another thing to note about keeping these soil samples like this is that we can use them for other things other than texturing. So we can use this same soil to practice our coloring, and we can also use it to help test for effervescence as well. So, you know, in the field, I am doing all of these things on each horizon, which is each soil. So you can use these samples for more than just one thing that you might want to practice or need to practice. So these are skills that the more you do them, the better you get at them. And so that is what I suggest to you if you're struggling, if you're like, oh man, I don't know, is just to practice. And it will come with time. So we're moving on to sample number 2 here. And we'll walk through that one as well. So you'll see here, I already have a texture ball that I was playing with earlier. So it's a little dried out, but we're gonna moisten it back up again, and we'll start from the top with our texture by feel analysis. And so this being a very objective thing, right, there are parts with this chart where the wheels maybe come off a little bit, right? And then that's where, once you've done it time and time again, you pick up on these little nuances of like, oh yeah, I remember when I textured that one sample that was a silty loam and it like ribboned for days, but it wasn't a very strong ribbon, right? And it was a weak ribbon. And so that's how you kind of pick up on those things. And pretty soon you're not going to need this flow chart. So this flow chart is really just here to help train you in how to think when you're texturing soils. Really, because as soon as you put the soil in your hand, you should be able to make observations about it, right? So like as soon as I picked this up earlier this morning, I was like, wow, this one feels a lot more silty than that other one, right? Or, you know, whatever. And as soon as I wet it up and I start working with it, I'm starting to notice the differences, starting to notice these different things, so that I get to the point where the ribbon is just to help me decide the clay and just to decide the sand, and then I'll use the texture triangle to arrive at a texture, right? But we'll still use this, don't worry. And we'll have both available at the state competition. So we have our ball, right? Does it remain in a ball when we squeeze it? Yeah, okay. So moving on, does it form a ribbon? Looking at that, yeah, it forms a ribbon. It forms a pretty good ribbon, right? But it's kind of, you know, it formed a long ribbon, but then I started to move it about and then it fell apart, right? So maybe that might be an indication that, oh, maybe it's not as strong as our texture before. So if we said that number one was a medium ribbon, right? And so this is talking about, you know, weak, medium, strong is how well does it stay together? So strong is going to be like it's almost plastic in nature. I mean, maybe that's not the right way to be talking about it, but it's going to hold together and hold its shape really well. That other one was sort of in between. This one's not really weak, right? And so I could see how someone might think, oh, this is a medium strength, and start going down that that column and looking at that. That's kind of what I did initially. But, you know, comparing it with other things sometimes will change your perspective of what you're feeling in the current moment, if that makes sense. So because this is our second one, we've already, you know, have an idea of what a clay loam feels like. Feeling this one, I'm like, yeah, okay, it might be a little bit different than that. It's different. It feels different to me. And so that's also important to know, that if you're like, it looks the same, it's all of these things that it's telling me according to the thing, the spreadsheet or the flow chart are the same, but it feels different, it should be different. Go with that. Trust your gut, trust your instinct. So we're gonna call that this is a weak ribbon, right? Okay, and we're gonna look at it. We're gonna kind of, it breaks apart in segments when we try and straighten it out a lot more than maybe our medium structured one did. And so when we hold it up here, I don't know, it's gonna be difficult to do this and not have it all fall apart, right? So it doesn't stay together very well. We can see it's long, but it doesn't really maintain its shape. So that would maybe be another indication that this is a weak ribbon, right? As if initially it holds its shape and it's very long, but then as soon as we try to measure it, it sort of falls apart, or it's very, I guess, floppy, is is a word we could use to describe it too, to indicate that it is weak. So then we're gonna do our wash next. And so again, I'm gonna cup my hand in the bowl of my palm. Gonna add some water and then take a little pinch. It doesn't take much, just a little bit. And then we're gonna wash that in our palm. And now we need to start noticing, is it gritty? Is it smooth? Is it somewhere in between? Right? And so feeling this one, I can feel the larger grains of sand, but there aren't a lot of them. So I'm going to go ahead and say that no, it is not a sandy loam. I don't really feel a lot of the sand. And another thing to think about with some of these more sandy textures is that you have to have at least 50% of that soil be sand in order for it to fall into a sandy texture. So if you're more numbers minded and you're texturing and you're looking and you're like, yes, 50% of this sample in my hand is sand, it's probably going to be in one of those sandy textured family classes, right? But that's not the case for sample number 2, okay? There's some sand, but not a lot. So we'll move on to the next one. Does it feel very smooth? You know, not really. I can still feel that there's sand in there. So it's gritty, but it's not overwhelmingly smooth. So we'll move on to that bottom one, that last one, which is loam. So number 2 is a loam. But again, definitely we could see where someone might interpret that ribbon as being medium. It's very close. That was a tricky one, right? So if you're sitting there thinking like, oh man, that was a medium ribbon, don't worry. That's also like, I'm not going to say that it's also right, but it's also a valid way of thinking. So you're on the right track, right? So if you kind of ended up going down that part of the sheet, don't worry, like we just want you to familiarize yourself with using this sheet, and just know that it's not going to be black and white, end all be all. There are a lot of caveats that are associated with this, but it's just the quickest, easiest, most efficient way to teach a lot of people these skills and introduce these skills and this way of thinking to people, okay? So again, I'm not gonna just toss this out. I'm gonna put it back in the bin for texture number 2 and seal it up, and it'll get put on the shelf where we can use it again next time. Okay. It's also best practice when you're first learning to wash your hands in between each texture. I'm not showing that because I would have to like run to the sink and back, and nobody wants to see that. So I'm just making sure I wipe off my hands really good in between textures. So moving on to the last one, sample number 3, which again, I started earlier in the day. But there was one thing that I'm going to note with this one that I think is important, and that is when I first picked it up and started making a texture ball, if you notice that it's really sticky, so it's sticking to your fingers, sticking to your hands, it's really hard to get it to form a ball because it's just sticking to your fingers, that's a really good indication that there's a lot of silt in the soil, right? So that's when what I mean is when you first pick it up, you're making observations. It's, when I add water, what happens, right? I also know that when it's a lot harder to squeeze this one, to make a ball, to do anything. Now it could just be because I'm old and my hands are worn out and they're getting tired, and this is the 3rd one I've done today, right? It could be that, or it could be that there's a lot more clay in this one than the other ones, right? So if it's a lot harder to work up, if it feels difficult to work up and it's sticky, there's usually some clay in there. So I'm gonna get this to a nice consistency, and we'll see if that hypothesis tracks, right? Okay, so we have a ball. It's still a ball, right? Okay, let's look at our ribbon. Ooh. Okay, well, it fell off, right? Okay. Ooh. So looking at this one, this ribbon, it seems to hold its shape pretty well. It's not really falling apart when I'm moving it about, waving it about, right? Well, it did there, but whereas our other one maybe fell and broke into like 3 or 4 pieces, we've still got, you know, 2 pieces, and I was really waving that one hard. So we're gonna measure this one out. And so we can see that we're at what, like roughly 10, 9, we're at 9 centimeters, right? So again, I'm gonna say that our ribbon strength is going to trump the length of the ribbon. And that should really always be the tiebreaker, okay? In that if you're like, oh, it's a really long ribbon, oh, but okay, but how strong is it, right? Because we can have really weak ribbons that are really long, and we can have really strong ribbons that are really short, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, we're gonna put it in a different category based on its length. Okay, so if you're looking for something to go off of, use the strength of the ribbon. Okay, so we're gonna say that this one is medium, right? Because it was long, but it still didn't hold its shape. Well, we waved it about too much, so it did break, but it didn't break into like a lot of pieces. So we'll go with medium. This is where it's very nuanced and tricky. Like, what is medium? Well, it's not weak and it's not strong. What does that look like? It's very difficult to know until you've done it many, many times, and then you can start separating and differentiating. Okay, this is what strong feels like. This is what weak feels like. So practice, practice, practice. That's all I can say, right? Is that it's something that you kind of have to discover and figure out for yourself. What does that mean to you? Again, because it's objective. Soil science is both an art and a science, and this is kind of where the art comes in a little bit. Okay, enough of that. We're ready to move on. You're anxious to know what this is. So, does it feel gritty? Well, based on what I said before about it being really sticky when I started working it up, I don't think so. We're going to do a sand wash anyway. Okay, just to confirm. I don't feel any grit at all. It actually feels very smooth, right? So that would put it at a silty clay loam, right? There's very little grit, if at all. And so that's really what you're gonna find when you're looking for something that's very smooth. Another thing that might be a little bit more of an advanced idea is that fine sand and coarse silt are going to feel very similar. And so that's maybe a curveball that you might encounter. We try not to do mean things like that at the Envirothon, but just keep that in mind as if you're going through and you're texturing and you're maybe getting frustrated if you have some known textures and you're like, why does this keep feeling feeling like it should be sandy or feeling like it should be silty, but it says it's sandy on the container, like what's going on? That's why. It's because coarse silt and fine sand, they feel very similar. They're almost the same size. And so that is it for our texturing. I'm gonna put that sample back in its box, and we'll be able to save those and use those another time. Yeah, I'm gonna wipe off my spill that happened. So just to reiterate, in case you got swept up in it all, number 1 was a clay loam, number 2 was a loam, and number 3 was a silty clay loam. And I'll just say this, that texture by feel is just a field method, right? It's not the end all be all. If we really want to know what the texture is, we're going to take samples. We're going to take grab samples like this, and we're going to run tests in the lab. And one of the tests that we do is something called a hydrometer method. So we will take our soil, we'll grind it up, we'll pass it through this 2mm sieve, and we make a sort of soil milkshake with it. So we put it in a cup with a known volume of water, and then we add something called sodium hexametaphosphate to it, which acts sort of like a soap in that it collects all of the organic matter that might be floating around in that soil, and it helps the soil particles disperse a lot easier. So then we'll take that slurry, that soil milkshake, and we'll put it in a graduated cylinder, and then we have a specialized little probe that we dip into that graduated cylinder, and it bobs a lot like a bobber or a buoy, right? So any of you who like to fish, it bobs like a bobber. And over a certain amount of time, so we have set times that we take a reading, whatever that reading is on that bobber, we'll write down. And over time, the idea is that all of the sands are going to settle out first, and then we'll have the silt, and then we'll have the clay at the very end. And so depending on what those readings are, we can do some calculations to get the amount of sand, silt, and clay that we can then locate on our triangle and figure out what the texture is. So that might have been another way that the textures of these soils could be calculated, especially in a professional or laboratory setting. So I don't know if there's any questions. Let me know. And if you have any questions in general, a really good resource is check with your local NRCS field offices. Reach out to your local soil survey offices. Most of the time, we're pretty open to answering questions and making sure that you maybe understand materials or things. Also, if you're looking for help or suggestions on how to store soil samples or prepare soil samples, or really anything related to soils, most of the time we'll be able to help you. So, okay, so for number 1, to get sand and clay percents, one trick that I like to use for clay especially is that rule of thumb that I've mentioned before, right? And just measure the length of your ribbon. So for number 1, we said this was a clay loam. So looking at our triangle, we know that it should have between about 27 and 40% clay, right? So that would be another thing. Once you get a little bit more comfortable with texturing, maybe you feel like you don't need the flow chart anymore. You know, you can start looking at the length of the ribbon and start thinking like, oh, how much clay do I think this has in it? So that's how I usually approach it when I'm out there in the field is I'll do the ribbon and okay, I'm gonna measure. We've got probably like 1, probably 2. So we know we have at least 20, right? And that's it's not a like for sure thing, but it helps put us in the ballpark, right? Because this is, again, where then the strength of the ribbon comes in as well. Because, yeah, we could have, again, a really long ribbon, but it's not very strong. And so does it have a lot of clay in it? Probably not. But this one, you know, just kind of based off this, I'd say, yeah, there's probably about, you know, either side of 30%. It would be my estimate. Okay. So about 30% clay. I'd say probably like 2 or 3% either side of that line. And then as far as sand goes, do this. And this is going to be both what do I feel and what do I see? Because a lot of times you can see the shine and the sparkle of the sand grains while it's in the wash, especially if it's a sunny day and especially if you've got nice lighting. So for this one, I'm going to go with probably about 25% sand, you know, give or take a few percent. So that would be number 1. Number 2, we said was a loam. Right, and another thing too with this, again, coming back to how subjective it is that, you know, you might be feeling this and you might get so good that instinctively you're like, yeah, this is what a loam feels like. This is what a loam feels like. You can look at the triangle and be like, okay, I know that I have these ranges of sand for it to be a loam, and I know that I have these ranges of clay for it to be a loam. And that can kind of help train you, but guide you in like, oh, how much clay is this, right? So for our loam, again, we've got this nice ribbon, but it definitely, feeling number 2 and number 1 and comparing them, this one does feel a lot easier to work with, which means that it probably has less clay in it, right? The one before it was a clay loam, this one's a loam. So yeah, we already kind of arrived at that conclusion. But I think that because the strength of the ribbon is so close to the one before it, you know, we probably have a fair amount of clay in here. So I would probably say 25, just because I like to use round numbers, but it's probably, you know, a couple percent either side of 25 would be my estimate. And then we'll do the sand. So this one had a little bit more sand in it. Right, and this one, you can kind of, again, I can kind of see the glint of the sand in the water. It doesn't show up well on camera, and this is a really awkward angle, you know, but I'll probably go with, you know, maybe 25% sand again for that one. Just because I didn't get a lot of it in that feel, but it's there. Okay, and then number 3, for our silty clay loam, if we look here, so we're over here on the triangle, so we shouldn't have too much sand in it, but we probably need, what is that, between 30 and 40% clay, right? So we'll work that one up, give it a ribbon. You know, and again, comparing it to our clay loam and our loam and knowing how much I said was in those samples, you can kind of adjust as you go and be like, okay, well, I know we call this what, a silty clay loam, so I know it should have between, you know, here and here. But how does it feel? It is a little harder to work up. It's a little harder to ribbon, but it still reminds me a lot of that first one. So I'm going to maybe go with 33% clay, you know, either side of 33 for that one. But I'm a little rusty, so that might be completely off. We'll see if we have lab data on it or not. But that would be my field estimate. And so that would be another thing too, if you're getting discouraged with this, is like field soil scientists, professionals, we get it wrong all the time. So don't feel too bad if you're like, oh man, I got that one wrong. Because, you know, when we get stuff back from the lab, we're like, wow, we need to, as a as a team, work on our texturing or work on whatever, right? Because our sometimes our field skills aren't as sharp as we want them to be. All right, yeah, not feeling hardly any sand in here at all. I don't really see any. So I'm gonna, just to be safe, I'm gonna say there's probably 5% sand. In number 3. So I'm not sure if we have the lab data for it or not. But that would be my field estimate.